This is a homily for Easter Sunday. The Gospel read at the Easter Vigil is Mark chapter 16, verses 1 to 7. The Gospel for Easter Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. John, chapter 20, verses 1 to 9. Each of the four Gospels gives us an account of disciples going to the tomb of Jesus early on Easter Sunday morning, but the details vary. That should not surprise us because each of the four evangelists is presenting the same story but from a different perspective. Who first went to the tomb? Well, according to Mark, Mary of Magdala, Mary the mother of James, and Salome went to the tomb when the Sabbath was over. It was very early in the morning on the first day of the week. Matthew tells us that there were two women, Mary of Magdala and the other Mary. They went to visit the tomb after the Sabbath towards dawn on the first day of the week. Luke also tells us that a group of women went to the tomb on the first day of the week at early dawn. They were Mary of Magdala, Joanna, and Mary the mother of James, and other women with them. They find the stone rolled away from the tomb, but they could not find the body of Jesus. When Peter is informed, he then runs to the tomb. Finally, the Gospel of John mentions only one woman, Mary of Magdala. Early on the first day of the week, when it was still dark, Mary went to the tomb. When she found that the stone had been moved away from the tomb, she tells Simon Peter what she has seen. And Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved both come to the tomb. Mary of Magdala is the only person mentioned in all four accounts of what happened on Easter Sunday morning. However, all four of the Gospels agree on one key fact. The tomb is empty. The body of Jesus is not there. In Mark's Gospel, a young man, presumably an angel, tells the women, "Do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. See the place where they laid him." An angel tells the women in Matthew's Gospel he is not here, for he has risen as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. In Luke's Gospel, the women entered the tomb but could not find the body of Jesus. And in John's Gospel, Mary of Magdala tells Peter and the disciple that Jesus loved, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have put him." In all four Gospels, we have an empty tomb. Let's turn for a moment to what is often called the fifth Gospel. The fifth Gospel is not a text, but the land where Jesus lived, the Holy Land, the setting of the Gospel story. The Incarnation means that in Jesus God became flesh and dwelt among us, but he dwelt among us in a particular time and place. That is why once we've visited the fifth Gospel, the Holy Land, we begin to hear the Gospel story in a new way. After all, there is no text without context, and that certainly includes the geographical context of the Gospel story. Speaking to journalists in January 2022, Pope Francis said this: "Making the Holy Land known means transmitting the fifth Gospel, that is, the historical environment and geographical area in which the Word of God was revealed and then made flesh in Jesus of Nazareth for us and for our salvation." So let's do that. Here you can see an illustration of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. Note that the site of Golgotha is just outside the city walls as they were at the time of Jesus. Here you can see an artist's impression of Golgotha and the tomb at the time of Jesus. The Romans crucified prisoners in very public places, close to one of the main entrances of a city. It was intended to be a deterrent. Defy us, and this is what you can expect. So the site of Golgotha was just outside the walls of Jerusalem and located in what had once been a rock quarry. The site was disbanded as a quarry in the 1st century BC. And here, very close by, is the site of the tomb where Jesus was buried, a tomb owned by Joseph of Arimathea. What this illustration doesn't represent accurately is the fact that the tomb was in a garden. John's Gospel tells us that in the place where he had been crucified there was a garden, and in this garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. Since it was the day of preparation for the Jews and the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. Here is what the tomb would have looked like. Mark tells us that the tomb had been hewn out of the rock. Christians continued to visit the tomb for over a century, that is, up until the foundation of Aelia Capitolina in 135 AD. Aelia Capitolina was the name that Hadrian gave to the rebuilt city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was almost totally razed after the siege of 70 AD. No visits to the tomb were possible after 135 AD because the Roman Emperor Hadrian ordered the quarry to be filled in to provide a level base for a temple he intended to build there. Hadrian obviously intended to obliterate the memory of this sacred Christian site, but his plan backfired, because Christians remembered that the site of the tomb and Golgotha was right underneath the site of the pagan temple. So the quarry was filled in to provide a level base for the temple. The early church historian Eusebius tells us, "With much labour they brought in soil from elsewhere and covered the whole site, and by raising the level and laying a stone pavement they concealed the divine cave under a heap of earth. And as though this were not enough, they built above ground a shrine of lifeless idols dedicated to the impure demon Aphrodite, where they poured foul libations on profane and accursed altars." The temple was flanked by a shrine honouring the goddess Aphrodite, or Venus. The statue of Aphrodite was constructed on the top of the rocky outcrop known as Golgotha. So here you can see the site of Golgotha and the site of the tomb in relation to Hadrian's temple. This temple remained until the time of the Roman Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. The Edict of Milan, promulgated in 313, gave Roman citizens what today we would call freedom of religion. It ended the persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire, and within a few generations, Christianity grew from being a small persecuted minority to the largest religion in the empire. In 324, Constantine became sole emperor of the Roman Empire, and increasingly saw himself as trusted with a divine mission to create a Christian empire. One of his main projects was to search for the tomb of Christ buried beneath Hadrian's temple. This entailed the demolition of Hadrian's temple. The early church historian Eusebius tells us what happened once excavations commenced. Eusebius was the bishop of Caesarea, just to the northwest of Jerusalem. He tells us in his Life of Constantine that the site of the tomb of Jesus had been covered to a great depth by rubble. But then he tells us that as layer after layer of the subsoil was removed, the venerable and most holy memorial of the Saviour's resurrection, beyond all our hopes, came into view. In other words, the tomb of Jesus could now be seen. Here you can see the church that the Emperor Constantine built on the site. A 5-aisled basilica to the right, and to the left, over the tomb, a rotunda that housed what is known as the edicule, literally a little house that covered the tomb itself. The peak of the rock called Golgotha, where Jesus had been crucified, was outdoors in the courtyard of the basilica. Here in the grounds of St. Peter in Gallicantu in Jerusalem is a model that gives an idea of what the complex would have looked like. But this is not what you see in Jerusalem today. This structure was set on fire by the Persians in 614 AD. It was repaired, but 4 centuries later, in 1009 AD, it was systematically destroyed by the Egyptian Shiite Caliph al-Hakim. The Christian community of Jerusalem was poor and could not afford repairs. When reconstruction work eventually commenced, with help from the Byzantine emperor, only the rotunda over the tomb was rebuilt. In 1099 AD, the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem, and they soon began the work of reconstructing the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is an aerial photograph of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as it is today. The larger of the 2 domes is above the tomb. This church is mainly the work of the Crusaders, but it incorporates parts of the 11th century Byzantine reconstruction following the destruction by al-Hakim in 1009 AD. Here is a cutaway of the interior of the church as it is today. To the left is the edicule housing the tomb of Christ, and to the right the rock of Golgotha. Inside the church you can still see part of the rocky outcrop that was Golgotha. On the top of this rocky outcrop, Jesus was crucified. Golgotha comes from the Aramaic word Golgotha, meaning place of the skull. In Greek it was topon ton kalumenon kranion, called the place of the skull. On the left here you can see a drawing of the edicule, and to the right a cutaway version showing the rock shelf on which the body of Jesus was laid when he was taken down from the cross. Here is a photograph of the edicule taken from the rotunda above. And here we are at the entrance of the edicule, the small structure built over the tomb of Jesus. On Easter Sunday morning, all the Gospels agree that the body of Jesus was not in the tomb. The Gospels of Matthew, Luke and John tell us about appearances of the risen Lord. Only Mark, the earliest of the 4 Gospels to be written, ends his Gospel with the women at the empty tomb. The Gospel for the Easter Vigil in Year B of the Church's liturgical cycle is Mark's account of the 3 women at the empty tomb. A young man, presumably an angel, tells the 3 women, "Do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. See the place where they have laid him." And Mark's Gospel concludes with the words, "And the women came out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and amazement had gripped them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." Most scholars agree that Mark ended his Gospel at chapter 16, verse 8, But you'll notice that copies of the New Testament include some additional verses 9 to 20, which give an overview of various appearances of the risen Lord. However, these additional verses are not in the earliest and most reliable manuscripts of Mark's Gospel, and the vocabulary and style differ from the rest of Mark. They were added by someone else at a later date, presumably because it was felt that the Gospel couldn't end so abruptly, with the women in fear and silence. Those scholars who argue that the Gospel couldn't have ended like that have offered alternative suggestions. Some have suggested that Mark was prevented from finishing his narrative by illness or some other mishap. Others have argued that the original ending describing appearances of the risen Lord has been lost. New Testament scholar Francis Maloney argues that the theory of a lost ending would create more problems than it solves. He argues that the original Gospel of Mark ended at chapter 16, verse 8, and the interpreter must make sense of Mark's literary and theological reasons for closing his Gospel with fear, flight, and silence of the women. And how do we make sense of the Gospel ending with fear, flight, and silence? Keep in mind that the failure of the male disciples has been an enduring motif throughout Mark's Gospel. On 3 occasions on the way to Jerusalem, Jesus tells the disciples what awaits him, but on each occasion they fail to understand. They are more concerned with positions of honour at his right and left hand, about which of them is the greatest. Now, when Jesus is arrested, the disciples fail again. Judas betrays Jesus with a kiss. Mark tells us that all the disciples deserted Jesus and fled. And it's in Mark's Gospel alone that we have the story of a young man who is following Jesus wearing nothing but a linen cloth. When they catch hold of him, he leaves the cloth behind and flees naked. 3 times Peter denies even knowing Jesus. "I do not know this man you are talking about." And now it would seem even the women who have followed Jesus through the experience of the cross to the grave finally join the other disciples in fear, flight, and failure. Francis Maloney explains, the explanation of the enigma of the failure of the women in chapter 16, verse 8, lies in Mark's desire to instruct his readers that the encounter between the risen Jesus and the failed disciples did not take place because of the success of the women. As the disciples failed, so also the women failed. In the end, all human beings fail. But God succeeds. God has raised Jesus from the dead. The Father has not abandoned the Son. The same God will also raise the disciples, men and women, from their failure. They will see the risen Lord in Galilee, but not because the disciples or the women succeed. The event that bridged the gap between the end of the Gospel of Mark and the community which heard it and read it took place because of the initiative of God and not the success of men or women. Let's look at the ending to Mark's Gospel from the point of view of Mark's audience, those who first heard or read his Gospel. Firstly, the ending is ironic because it turns back upon the audience. The audience is expecting one thing, but it gets another. As the story reaches its climax, the audience must surely expect that the women will do what the angelic messenger instructs them to do. They will tell Peter and the disciples that Jesus is going ahead of them to Galilee, and that they will see him there. But the women are silent. This ironic ending is Mark's way of challenging the reader or hearer of the gospel. The audience, rather than being silent, as the women were, are to proclaim the good news courageously in the face of persecution. It's as though Mark the evangelist suddenly turns to the audience and addresses them directly. You may have thought that this story was about somebody else, but now you've got a decision to make. What are you going to do about it? Let me come back to a key point in the resurrection narratives. The tomb was empty. The body of Jesus was not there. All four Gospels report this. In spite of the differences about the numbers of angels and witnesses, all four evangelists agree that the tomb was empty. The body was nowhere to be found. Only the grave clothes were left behind. Let's come back to the conclusion of Mark's Gospel. Mary of Magdala, Mary the mother of James, and Salome are told that the body of Jesus is not in the tomb. He has been raised. How would they have understood that? What did it mean to say that Jesus had been raised? Theologian Fleming Rutledge offers this reflection. Suppose for a moment that the angel in Mark's story had stood outside the still closed tomb and said to the women, "The spirit of your master lives on," or "The immortal soul of Jesus has gone into heaven." Maybe this would have comforted the women. Maybe it would have encouraged them to pick up their lives, warmed them with a religious glow and a sense of possibility. Maybe. In view of what they had witnessed at Golgotha, I doubt it. In any case, this is not at all what Mark describes. Mark says that Jesus has been raised, bodily raised from the dead. There is no longer a body in the tomb. Whenever we recite the Nicene Creed, we also express our belief in the resurrection of Jesus. We say, "He suffered death and was buried and rose again on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures." In other words, the tomb was empty, the body was gone. Jesus is raised to a bodily existence. To be sure, it is a different body, a body that can pass through doors, a body that isn't always recognized, and yet it is a real body, a body that bears the marks of the nail and spear wounds, a body that can be touched and felt, a body that eats fish and cooks breakfast by the shore of the lake. The risen Lord was not a disembodied spirit, but a real body with whom the disciples could eat and drink. In several of his books, the New Testament scholar Tom Wright makes the claim that we have Platonized our eschatology. What does he mean? The English word eschatology comes from the Greek word eschatos, which means last. So eschatology is that branch of theology dealing with the last things, with death, judgment, and eternal life. What does it mean to say that we have Platonized our eschatology? The Greek philosopher Plato died in the middle of the 4th century BC. He taught that the human person was both body and soul. Body, soma, and soul, psyche. But Plato argued that the soul was immortal and therefore existed before the body and will continue to exist after the body is gone. He also likened the body to a prison. The implication of this is that the real me is the soul, and for the time being it has been imprisoned in this body of flesh. But at death, the soul is finally set free from its bodily prison. Immortality of the soul was a commonplace belief in the Hellenistic world of Jesus, although it was not a Jewish idea, nor can Christian eschatology be reduced to the immortality of the soul. Christianity proclaims the resurrection of the body. So when Wright argues that we have Platonized our eschatology, he's saying that many people have interpreted life after death as souls going to heaven, rather than the promised new creation. I'll come back to that idea of new creation in a moment. When we recite the Nicene Creed, we express our belief in the resurrection of the dead. I look forward to the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. The Apostles' Creed is more specific. It makes explicit what resurrection of the dead means by using the words resurrection of the body. When we recite those words, we are expressing our belief that we, like Jesus, will bodily rise from the dead. As we've seen, the risen body of Jesus is a different body. But what about us? What kind of body will we have at the resurrection of the dead? That's precisely the question that the Corinthians asked Paul. How are dead people raised? And with what sort of body do they come? Paul uses the image of sowing a seed. The body that dies is like a grain of wheat that is sown. There is no way that you can tell from looking at a grain of wheat what the harvest will be like. So Paul says, what is sown is perishable, but what is raised is imperishable. What is sown is a physical body, and what is raised is a spiritual body. The contrast is between our present body, which is corruptible, decaying, and doomed to die, and our future body, which is incorruptible, undecaying, and never to die again. Tom Wright explains what Paul has said in these words. We sometimes speak of someone who's been very ill as being a shadow of their former self. If Paul is right, a Christian in the present life is a mere shadow of his or her future self, the self they will be when the body which God has waiting in his heavenly storeroom is brought out, already made to measure, and put on over the present one, or over the self that will exist after bodily death. So as I grow older, I begin to realize that I am only a shadow of my former self. What St. Paul would say is that our present perishable body is only a shadow of our future self. Here we are talking about the new creation. The book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, speaks of a new heaven and a new earth. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The first heaven and the first earth had disappeared now. Then I heard a loud voice call from the throne, "Look, here God lives among human beings. He will make his home among them. They will be his people, and he will be their God, God with them. He will wipe away all tears from their eyes. There will be no more death, and no more mourning or sadness or pain. The world of the past has gone." Then the one sitting on the throne spoke, "Look, I am making the whole of creation new." One of the key documents of the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world, puts it like this: "We know neither the moment of the consummation of the earth and of human beings, nor the way the universe will be transformed. The form of this world, distorted by sin, is passing away, and we are taught that God is preparing a new dwelling and a new earth in which righteousness dwells, where happiness will fill and surpass all the desires of peace arising in the hearts of men and women. Justin Brierley hosts the Unbelievable podcast, among other shows. He is passionate about creating thoughtful conversations about faith with both Christians and skeptics. The title of his most recent book is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. The book's subtitle is Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. Brierley states that a number of public intellectuals that he has interviewed in his podcast have identified the problem in the West. The problem is a lack of meaning, an identity crisis, the anxiety produced by living in a world without a story to live by. Brierley argues that people need a story to live by, but the stories we have been telling ourselves in the last several decades have been growing increasingly thin and superficial. Many of Brierley's podcasts have featured interviews with people who have converted to Christianity. These converts all shared something in common. The journey or realization only took place once other stories had been tried, but had ultimately failed to make sense of things. The heights of human glory, the depths of human misery, the search for the meaning behind it all. Only the Christian story seemed to be able to encompass these things. Only the Christian story made sense of their stories. On this festival of Easter, we celebrate the story of Jesus' victory over sin and death. His story makes sense of all other stories, past, present, and future. And his story alone offers life in abundance. We die with Christ so that we can rise with him to live forever in the new creation, the new heaven and the new earth.